What you're looking at can best be described as a beautiful, well-made tool watch. It's familiar, yet also a little different. Compared to many of its siblings, this one has a bit of a fun and quirky streak. It's also one, for better or worse, that's a tad gimmicky. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to talk about the brand new Christopher Ward C60 Tide. When the original C60 Sapphire came out, I became a little bit obsessed with it. Almost bought one a couple of times. When it first came out, I was dead set on finally checking out Christopher Ward. And I thought if I was going to buy one, I might as well get their latest and greatest. Yet the very thing that made that watch so interesting is the same thing that held me back. While the translucent sapphire dial made the watch unique and intriguing to look at, it was also something that I kept questioning if I'd enjoy in the long run. And at its price, I wasn't just going to buy one to find out. Yet that C60 Sapphire over the last couple of years has always been somewhere in the back of my mind. And that's even after I've bought a couple of other Christopher Ward watches. Which is why when Christopher Ward reached out and said they had a loaner of its newer, slightly larger sibling, I jumped at the chance to check it out. And thanks to it, I finally have an answer. But we'll circle back to that in a bit, because we first need to get to know the C60 Tide better. The Tide is a modest-sized diver at 42mm, and it has a lug-to-lug of just over 49. It's also a bit chunky at 14.1mm, but a lot of that can be forgiven with the 600 meters of water resistance, which is admittedly a tad overkill, but at least that means you're never going to have to worry about it. It's also surprisingly solid. Even on this hybrid strap, the Tide weighs in around 120 grams. Which easily translates into a fairly well-made feel when you pick it up, as well as wear it. Generally, Christopher Ward offers the C60 Trident divers in 3 different sizes. You have a 38, a 40, and a 42. But when it comes to the Sapphire line, they've only previously offered it in a 40mm diver, which means you can kind of think of this C60 Tide in a couple of different ways. The first of which is that it's a special edition, slightly larger version of those C60 Sapphires. Or you could think of it as a special Sapphire edition of their regular 42mm C60 Tridents. Keyword in both of those is special, because there are some things in this design that make it a little bit different than your standard C60s. The first of which is that it's a certified COSC or COSC chronometer, where the regular C60s aren't. But the Tide also has a special design, and it's one that utilizes some upcycled ocean plastic in its build. Which is really where that hashtag Tide name comes from, as it's a name it shares with Christopher Ward's line of Tide straps, which are also made of upcycled ocean plastic. But what it all boils down to is that this is a special edition that's really designed to help promote awareness of the ocean and conservation efforts. So you can kind of think of this like the Seiko Save the Ocean editions of their watches, except here they're not exactly subtle about it. With my 7¼ inch wrist, the lug-to-lug here is a tad longer than I prefer, but the curvature of the lugs do compensate for that a bit. During my time with the Tide, I primarily wore it on this hybrid strap, and on the wrist it did feel a touch top-heavy at times, which is understandable when you consider the weight and the height of the watch. But even despite that, overall it was fairly comfortable throughout the day. Christopher Ward refers to this case design as a light catcher, and that is a very apt description, with the various polished and brushed sections just beautifully playing with the light as it moves around, which really draws your attention to the sleek and curvy nature of the case. But the Tide just doesn't look good, but it's also expertly executed as well. Christopher Ward is known for creating well-made watches, and that's a reputation that's well deserved. At the right, you have a signed screw-down crown, which is pretty much a perfect size for this watch. With its gripply knurling, it's fairly easy to get a hold of and use. It's also signed with the hashtag symbol instead of the regular Christopher Ward logo, as well as having an inset piece of that upcycled plastic, once again signifying this is something a little different and a little special for the brand. The bezel's another area Christopher Ward has done right. Stainless steel, ceramic insert, 120 click, unidirectional, and a great action with no backplay. Once again, it's pretty much exactly what you want. It's also an area that shows off one of my favorite features of the watch. It's a pretty small and in some ways a silly thing, but I just love this fixed metallic ring that sits in between the bezel and crystal. In some ways it's kind of repetitive to the chapter ring on the dial, but it also acts as a nice frame for the crystal and creates a good bridge between the various elements. The markings on it also make it extremely easy to set and use the timing bezel, as your eyes don't have to drop down a level to the indices to see where it's lined up, which once again is not necessarily a big thing. This is a really small thing, but it's something I like and I'd like to see more of. However, as good as the case is, the dial is where things get really interesting. The dial itself is made out of a translucent sapphire, letting you catch minor glimpses of the movement underneath. This is very similar to the standard C60s, except here Christopher Ward added this wavy pattern to the dial that kind of muddies the waters, so to speak. It takes an otherwise clean and straightforward dial and makes it a tad chaotic. But it's not all bad. In fact, it makes the watch a little bit more visually interesting, especially because the pattern is loomed, and that creates a really cool design element when the lights go out. It also makes the movement underneath a little less visible, making it more of a murky shadow sitting just underneath the surface, which isn't necessarily a problem because there's nothing really interesting going on with the movement anyways. Now, surrounding the dial are these applied, beautiful rectangular applied indices, and the finishing here is beautifully done, just like the hands. The indices have brushed sides and a polished angular edge sitting at the front, once again creating another element that beautifully catches the light. But more importantly, the light shimmering off those inner edges of the indices also guides your eyes right to the center of the dial, and I think this is all part of that whole light catcher thing. Now, just beyond that, we have a chapter ring in white and blue. It's there, but it's not overly noticeable with the sapphire dial, and it's not quite as noticeable as the markings on the inner ring between the bezel and the crystal. There's also one really unusual element here at the 3 and 9. And here you can see screws that I'm assuming are holding the dial to the movement. Now, as necessary as these things are, they do look a little odd, and otherwise break up a clean pattern. Sitting just above the 6 sits a framed date window with a black date wheel, which is honestly a welcome change from most of the other C60s, as they usually place the date at the 3. Which finally leads us to talk about the text on the dial, and specifically the large Christopher Ward brand name sitting at the top. And if there's one thing I've heard constantly criticized about Christopher Ward, it's their branding on the dial. A lot of people see it as just too big, too prominent, and just too much in your face. For some, it's a complete deal killer, and for others, it's just something you kind of learn to live with, and that's kind of where I'm at with them. Specifically on the Tide though, I think thanks to that sapphire dial, this is one of the least obnoxious applications I've seen, as it does seem to blend in more. But for those that love pretty much everything else about Christopher Ward, there is hope, as they've recently released some pictures of their new watch. And if you look at the dial, you'll notice something a bit different. Anyway, let's move on to the Lume, and the Tide here has a great Lume profile, with that loomed elements of the sapphire dial really coming to life and giving this just a killer look. Unfortunately, that killer look doesn't last long, and in the end you are kind of left with a standard looking design. With regard to longevity, it's good. In this comparison test, you can see that it just outlasts a Seiko Turtle. So I feel confident saying that this has good lume, but not necessarily great lume. But one interesting thing to note here, and maybe some of you caught it, is that to the left, I also have the Christopher Ward C63 GMT, which I'm actually wearing right now. And it actually seems to outlast the C60 Tide, which is honestly surprising when you consider that it's a smaller field watch compared to a larger diver. Now, the Tide still has good lume, so I'm not necessarily holding this against it, but I think it's a real positive for the C63. So anyone who's interested in one of those, know that it has great lume. Now, while the Tide is available with a bracelet, Christopher Ward didn't send one along, so I can't really talk to you much about that. However, I can talk to you about both of their other options, both of which are good. The first of which is this hybrid strap, and this is where it has a Cordura outer layer covering a rubber interior. This is easily the best hybrid strap I've run across, as it gives you the instant comfort and flexibility of a good rubber strap with a more sophisticated look, which winds up creating a go anywhere and do anything kind of strap. I know we usually refer to those as watches, but this is a strap that does exactly that. And that is perfect for a good looking diver. And out of the two they sent, this one is easily my favorite. The other strap they sent are their hashtag Tide straps, which are made from upcycled ocean plastic, and they're a bit more subtle on the front end. Now, these ones are a little tricky to talk about. I've actually had a set before that came on the C63. And in the long run, I'd say they're great. Yet, you may not ever get to that point, as when you first get them, they are extremely stiff and rather uncomfortable to wear. And you may be inclined to take them off, throw them in a corner, and just never give them a second chance. But if you do, and if you kind of stick with it for a bit, it does wind up being a great strap. As for the movement, Christopher Ward decided to use a Sellita SW200, which is a good choice for the watch, and here they decided to use the top chronometer grade. And remember that the whole watch itself has gone through a COSC certification, which does guarantee you an accuracy between -4 and +6 seconds a day. And that certification is obviously one of the reasons there's a premium over these than, say, the standard C60s or the C60 Sapphires. And whether or not you care about that is kind of up to you. To me, it's kind of like an ISO diver's rating. It's nice to have, but it's not necessarily something I base my entire decision on. Now, the price for the Tide starts at $1,150 for the watch on the Tide strap. It's a little bit more if you want the hybrid strap, and a bit more if you want the bracelet. Whichever option you pick, it places the Tide in kind of a tricky pricing tier to talk about, at least for me, as this is not a luxury watch by any means, yet it's still priced well above the affordable watch spectrum. Yet, depending on who you talk to when it comes to value, it could be compared to both, and sometimes at the same time. So value is really subjective when you start talking about watches in this price range. Now, from what I've personally seen, Christopher Ward in general has a sense of refinement that exceeds most affordable watches out there. And if that's something you're looking for, say you want to step up and you're willing to pay for it, Christopher Ward is rather reasonable. And for the Tide specifically, $1,150 isn't bad for a COSC certified diver. However, for my money, I'd go a different route. And this does bring us full circle back to that original question with the original C60 Sapphire. As in, would it be something I'd like long term? And after spending a few weeks with its bigger brother, I can definitively say I wouldn't. The watch is extremely well made and the Sapphire dial can be cool and interesting, but it's just not for me. Don't get me wrong, it's an interesting concept, at least when you're new to it, but it didn't take me long to realize that there's nothing really to look at under that sapphire crystal. The date changes over at midnight, but that's about it. When you're talking like an open heart design, that's open heart because there's something to actually look at. But here, you're just looking at various shades of gray, never moving, never changing. It's all kind of static, and honestly a little bit boring. So it's not exactly what I'd call engaging. And in the long run, I've started to see this as more of a gimmick, as there really isn't much of a point to it. Now, I know skeletonized movements in general are also considered gimmicky, but perhaps that's what this needed, or maybe a semi-skeletonized movement, or an open heart movement. Just something to give this watch a reason to have that translucent dial, other than just the sake of having it. So for my money, if I was in the market for a Christopher Ward diver, I'd probably get the standard C60 in blue and save a couple $100. And I'd probably get it in 40mm as well. That way, I still get everything that's great about the C60 with a dial that's more traditional and perhaps more versatile. Although, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not really in the market for another Christopher Ward. I've already got the C65 Super Compressor and the C63 GMT, and I'm quite happy with both of those. In fact, if you're interested in either of those are two watches I'd easily recommend. And because of them, at the moment, my Christopher Ward cravings have been fully satisfied. Now, that said, the C60 Tide is still an amazing diver. It's beautifully designed and expertly executed. And while it's not personally for me, I could easily see how some people would like this. And especially for those that already have a large collection with what I refer to as blue diver syndrome. Blue diver syndrome is where you like blue divers, and really like blue divers, and you tend to gravitate towards them, and you tend to accumulate them. And at some point you do realize that you kind of have a problem as you have way too many blue divers. The C60 Sapphire and the C60 Tide are watches that have a lot of familiarity to them. Yet the Sapphire dial turns it into something a little bit different. So I could easily see how someone who already has a great blue diver, or 2 or 3, look at these and think that there's something unique, and something they could add to their collection and have it stand on its own. They look at it and see not just another blue diver. So while this particular watch isn't for me, I could easily see how someone could love it. And as for Christopher Ward in general, they're a brand I'd easily recommend. Anyway, that's my take on the Christopher Ward C60 Tide. As always, let me know yours down below. And also let me know if you'd like to see a review of the C65 Supercompressor or the C63 GMT, and let me know which one you'd prefer to see first. As usual, you guys know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.